Welcome back, everybody. Today we have Dr. Scott Brown with the University of Missouri Extension, and he's here to talk about dairy markets and beef processing. But first, we have kind of a big room today, so let's do some quick introductions. And then how about Malieka? We'll go to you, then Mike, then Tom, and then Dr. Brown can take off from there.
Hi, Malieka Bordigioni at the University of Nevada, Reno. I work on the FAPRI project and also for the University Center for Economic Development.
I'm Mike Helmar, University of Nevada, Reno. I work on with the University Center for Economic Development with the FAPRI project, and I also work with the Agricultural Experimentation in the College of Ag.
Okay, I'm Tom Harris. I'm a professor in the Department of Economics in the School of Business. I also have an appointment as a state extension specialist in community development, and I'm director of the University Center for Economic Development, and I have a joint appointment in the Nevada Ag Experiment and Cooperative. Oh, I'm kind of like a NASCAR, ain't I? I'm a Nevada Agriculture Experiment Station and Nevada Cooperative Extension.
Great. Well, Dr. Brown, let's learn a little bit about what's going on with the dairy markets and beef.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I appreciate the chance to visit with you all today, and I'll spend a few minutes here just kind of looking over what I think are the key issues. Certainly COVID-19 has had a marked impact on a number of livestock commodities, dairy being one of them, and in fact probably was one of the very first stories that we saw in the news about milk being dumped. As you know, when food service was halted with COVID-19 outbreak, and whether you want to talk about school fluid milk use or other food service uses, we just got a backlog starting right away, and we ended up in a situation where milk really had very little value, and without a home, many producers were left to dump that milk as cooperatives around the country tried to work on ways to best minimize the impacts. Since that period of time, so we've seen a lot of change, I guess, as I kind of look at what's going on in dairy markets. And I really point to two major issues that I think have been important to try to get things in better alignment. So number one, we've seen a number of cooperatives and in some cases proprietary processors as well operate base programs. So telling producers they'll accept all the milk that might be delivered to them, but there's only going to be a certain proportion of that milk that will be priced at current market prices, and anything you produce over some set amount would likely see some discounts. And again, it was the idea of trying to get supply, short run supply, in a little better balance with demand. And so that was kind of the first start of this. How do we get the amount of milk we're being dumped to work down over time? And I will say, although we're not done probably with milk being dumped, it's a much better situation than we saw just a few weeks ago in the industry across the country. At the same time, I'm not sure I'm ready to call the bottom of COVID-19, but it's certainly looking like we're trying to work our way out of that situation. As the country slowly reopens, I do see food service pulling cheese and butter prices higher. It has been a roller coaster ride when you think about some of these prices. We started the year with cheese prices a little shy of $2 a pound. When you look at the CME cash cheese price falling all the way to $1, and now we're setting right around $1.90. That's some severe volatility to have to deal with. And then, of course, the federal government providing help in terms of the CFAP program. I think that's going to help producers as we look at some of those details as well. And I'll just spend a couple of minutes looking at a few slides here for us. The U.S. all milk price, as we went through 2019, was moving higher in the country, so higher producer pay prices. But as we ended the year, we were already starting to see a downturn. And I think that had a lot to do with too much supplies of milk already coming back to the marketplace. COVID-19 certainly added to that, although we only have estimates here through March of 2020. We know that we've got further to fall when we probably see the April price, but that may be the bottom in terms of milk prices. I frankly could see some stronger prices as we finish the year. On the cow number side, A similar situation when we looked at 18 and 19, we were lowering cow numbers, but then we started building. And I think COVID-19 has certainly put the end to much growth in terms of U.S. cow numbers. If we look at dairy product prices, again, what we talk about, and these are NASS surveyed prices, so a little less volatile than the CME prices that we normally think about. So instead of cheese and butter that were at $2 when we started the year, they fell to about $1.15 to $1.10. But you notice the curve here on the very end, and again, NASS prices that tend to lag those CME prices a little bit. We've seen some nice recovery, and I expect we're going to continue to see some higher prices. However, I remind us that we really haven't seen the worst of the economic downturn and the effects of that economic downturn on demand for things like dairy products. I'm not sure we can maintain the kinds of levels we've seen of late. And so I think there's phases here that we can talk about, and I'll save that maybe for a little bit of discussion. I just want to, for a minute, remind folks of the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program that USDA announced last week and giving us final details. $16 billion in total funding going out in the different programs across all commodities. I always remind us the bottom bullet of, this is my current understanding of the CFAP program. It will change, and of course, FSA always has final say in these things. But providing producers a couple of payments here, different types of payments, I should say. So we're going to take their first quarter 2020 production, multiply it by $4.71 per hundredweight under the CARES Act payment rate. They're also getting another $1.47. That payment rate's adjusted by some seasonality. It basically adds another couple cents to that $1.47, just to give you some sense of what's available for dairy producers from those payments. Producers are eligible regardless of whether they were in dairy margin coverage or things like dairy revenue protection, dairy RP. So I think that's going to be helpful to producers. And that's kind of where we sit, I guess, from a dairy side. And maybe I'll stop and see if we have some discussion related to dairy before we move on.
Any questions?
Well, okay, I asked one, and Scott and Mike and Malieka can tell me also if I may be out of line. In Nevada, we have a very big dairy farmers in Fallon is dry milk, and a very big part of that is export to China. How do you think, and there's a lot of things going on with China now, number one, the dry milk market, and number two, the potentials for export to China. What do y'all see in the future?
Well, we need to make sure that we're specific here when we talk about our dairy plant. It's primarily whole milk powder, which is a much smaller market than non-fat dry milk or skim milk powder. And China is our largest customer. Although, back up a minute, that dairy plant can make a non-fat dry milk as well. I'm not sure what they do with the butterfat, but they make the non-fat dry milk, so they can switch to that. But they're primarily geared towards that Chinese and now some other Asian countries whole milk powder. And so now we're talking about the big question of what will China do. Even before this started, and even before phase one, China was in and out of that market as it is many other markets. Now, from the news that I've heard, and not seen any hard data on it, and I've heard both sides of this, and Malieka, I think you have too, is that China is attempting to abide as much as it can to phase one commitments. And then the next day you hear that it isn't. But the problem with that is that the phase one commitments are a total expenditure commitment and not commodity specific. So it's possible that if China goes back into that market, that it could help Nevada.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you, Mike. I think when you look at the whole milk powder market in the world, there's some reasons to be optimistic about some gains in trade. You've talked China a lot, and I'll agree that phase one if they're really going to hit those commitments, probably it's beneficial, the whole milk powder beneficial to the processing plant that sits there in Nevada. Trying to figure out whether the Chinese are going to meet those commitments or not is another whole question that we could spend hours talking about. But to me, that's the critical piece of that. However, I do think there's some stronger demand more generally in Asia for whole milk powder products. And again, I think we're slowly getting ourselves in that newer plant setting there certainly has been in a position to better hit what consumers want in terms of that whole milk powder market that's out there. So I'm optimistic that we can get some recovery there as we go. I'm not suggesting that happens in the next couple of months, but I guess as I look out 18, 24 months, to me, positioning in whole milk powder markets is not a bad place to be. I always keep saying that when you look at demand for ag products generally, the growth in demand is going to occur outside the United States, not within the United States. And so positioning yourself to be able to serve that international market place is still one that I think is a smart bet longer term.
Okay. Should we move on to meat processing?
I will share my screen back here. All right, so this is a very interesting discussion, and I think it's happening in a number of states around the country, and has a lot to do with just what's been the slowdown, shutdowns of meat processing plants around the country as a result of COVID-19. I will say that where we sit today is a lot different than where we sat just a couple of weeks ago. When you look at the recovery of many of these large plants, we're now talking about daily cattle slaughter running above 100,000 head. We were below or right at 70,000 head at kind of the bottom. We're back with daily hog slaughter right around 400,000 head a day. We were well below that. So we are seeing that commodity processing side recover. Why do I talk about that to begin with? Because I think that gave some local processing, smaller processors, opportunities to gain some new customers who are looking for alternatives as they went to the grocery store and either found shelves bare or nearly empty. And that's kind of the start. Now, you now talk to many of these small producers, and I'll use Missouri since I know that better. You'll find many of them that are they're booked well in advance, months in advance. One today I heard all the way into October of 2021, and other cases where we have a lot of our small processors who in November shut down and do nothing but deer processing. Some of them saying we're not going to process deer for the first time in several years. So it's certainly a positive for these processors. I kind of wonder in a post-COVID-19 world, what kind of longer term carve out can these small processors have? And I think there's opportunities. I think there's a place for these kind of, and I don't say niche in a negative way. I think building a niche is a good opportunity to connect local processing with local consumers. And likely that's a premium for your product. I want to make sure, and the other slide that I have for us today is just to remind us that there are large economies of scale in beef processing. We're not, as small processors, going to compete with many of the large plants that we see in operation today. So this is a way probably too complicated table to make the point that if you take commodity beef, for example, and it's the bottom half of the table that I have here, you'll notice they say the kind of average break-even price, and this is a little dated at this point, but still relevant, was $4.65, where the break-even for local processing is more like $8. Now, why is that? Number one, I'll say, if you look at the commodity set of rows that are there, there's no processing costs associated. Why is that? That commodity beef, we're going to talk about the offal, so parts of the carcass that if you're a local processor probably have no value. In fact, you might have to pay a disposal fee to render those products. In those large plants, when you're producing a high volume of some of those offal products, it really offsets the cost of processing. And so you got a lot more products that you're pulling out of that individual animal than you are if you're on the local side. And so there's a lot of the difference that we face. And so I argue here in Missouri, if we're going to do more local processing, what are consumers willing to pay for that? What's a Missouri branded product worth to them? I think we could say the same thing in Nevada, developing those kind of local products. So as long as we understand we're not going to probably compete with small plants in a commodity market, but we can maybe find our own niche that has a higher value market. Those are the opportunities that I think can be with us longer term. I just always remind producers here in Missouri or processors here in Missouri you have to be a good marketer. This is more than being a good cattleman. You better be a good marketer if you're going to make this work long term. So just a few minutes on what I see as some possibilities on that local beef processing side.
Very good. Thank you so much. Any questions, Malieka, Mike, and Tom?
We've been talking a lot, Scott, about beef processing here in Nevada. You're probably well aware that's our largest proportion of our ag sector overall. We sell mostly on the hoof. We have one USDA processor here in Reno, but same deal before COVID. I think they were booked out 12 months in advance or something like that. And that, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they are tied in with they're still tied in with the university. Yeah. So they get some of their funding through Experiment Station, or is that right? Or
True. Yeah.
through Cabner College of Ag. So yeah, this has been a hot topic of conversation among many different groups that we work with. So I have several questions, and we don't have to do them all, but when you say small processor, so the last table that you showed, I had read that paper, and then I read the paper that you were first author on, looking at Missouri, and they were both just fabulous. Really great documentation. I don't know the title off the top of my head, but that is, if you want to reference that, then that is really good piece of information, even though it's Missouri specific. I think there's a lot of good information for any state. But anyway, so smaller could be 9 head a day, 25 head a day, something like that. Where do you see, or can you say what scale of a smaller processor you could see being successful in the niche without a negative connotation market?
Yes, so that's a good question, and I actually, it can be bigger than we might think. All right, and I say that, you talked about 9 head a day. I don't have a great definition of the breakpoint, but I go, if you're going to be in that, I'm going to put it this way: less than 1,000 head a day, you're not in the commodity business. And because there's too many economies of scale to be had above that level. And I know some will disagree with me probably a lot about that point, but you have a lot of these very large plants operating that make their money on 0.5 cents a pound. And that's not what we're talking about in many of these cases. So, and again, I know probably the same thing happening in Nevada. A lot of cattlemen unhappy with cattle prices. They did fall. They fell a lot more than we saw record wholesale beef prices. And I think a lot of folks are, what are the alternatives? I want closer to that marketplace. And I remind us, COVID-19 had some effects that we likely don't see repeat very often. So don't go get in that local business thinking that we're always going to have record wholesale beef prices and these low cattle prices. And again, I don't say that going, I'm anti, I just want producers to walk in with eyes wide open that, hey, there's times when this might be really good and other times when we might want someone else to process those cattle and worry about the beef from them. So it depends on where markets are, and COVID-19's just been crazy in terms of the effects that we've seen.
Yeah, I agree, Scott. And the context that we're putting any discussions that we might have here in Nevada is we're trying to get away from that. This will fix COVID. Look where the markets are now. No, that's not what we're looking at. What we're looking at is post-COVID. Is there now a change in risk acceptance or risk adversity to make a small plant viable? We got a couple of things going on here in Nevada. One is that we're a food desert. We do not produce our meat. We buy it in from other places, some from California, but California basically serves most of its own market. We still get a lot of our beef coming out of those packers in the Midwest and places like that. So there's a transportation cost added onto it to get here to Nevada, which makes us a higher priced area. So the question is if we eliminate or drastically reduce transportation costs of animals to the plant, and then on the outside, reduce those transportation costs into our local markets, are we able to pencil out some profits? Those are the things we're wondering. I mean, I know you don't know the answer to that right now, but that's kind of the context that we're in, not as this fixes COVID and COVID creates this opportunity. No, we want to see when markets are back to normal, can we do it?
Yeah, so Mike, your point's a good one of we can have a lot of small processors try to come online, and it does not take the place of the plant shutdowns we have in these large operations. That's a wholly different discussion, but for me, it's an opportunity to connect to consumers that in the past may just went to the grocery store and bought whatever was there, that now say, hey, I'm going to go to Mike Helmar's local processing plant, and I've created a connection to him, and I'm going to honor that connection longer term. So it's the marketing that connects to me, local producers, local processors, to local consumers, that has an opportunity longer term post-COVID. I might have at one point said, if COVID-19 is one and done, we'll go back to our old ways pretty quickly. And I still think there's a little bit of that goes on. But if I'm a local processor right now, this is where I got to build my brand. I'm going to build my brand, trying to hold those consumers longer term. And to me, the issue here is a lot more about how do I want to market to make sure that I grab those consumers and I keep them with me longer term. I think there's a lot of opportunities. At the same time, I'll remind us, processing cattle is not for the faint of heart, right? It's hard work. And finding folks equipped to do that. I just remind us that we have a lot of fairly older processors sitting here in Missouri who are always looking for the next generation that want to cut meat because it's hard work.
I have one more question, and this also refer to, can you tell me the name of that paper? It was
Yes, so if you, I think if you actually Google Missouri Beef Value Added Project, you will find that paper. It was done a few years ago. So we're in Missouri. Depending on the year, the number 2 or number 3 beef cow state in the country. Oklahoma and Missouri trade back and forth, that number 2 or number 3 spot. And most of our calves are destined to be fed outside of Missouri. We ship a lot of them, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, some to Iowa as well. And so our focus a few years ago was, can we feed more cattle in Missouri, get more value added to occur in Missouri? And naturally, then that became the discussion of, can we create processing? Now, I think when we were down this road, there was always both avenues, this local idea, but then also, can we get in the commodity business? Feeding cattle in Missouri is a little tough, just given the amount of rain that we get. So if we're going to feed cattle in Missouri, we're going to put them under roof. That has larger capital outlays than many of the feed yards that you see in Western Kansas that I always say have sophisticated feed mills and vet services, but the rest of it is pretty low cost in my mind. Putting a roof over a feeding facility in Missouri has a cost, capital cost that stays with us. But that's been much of our discussion. That was much of the reason why that study was originally done, just to talk about the feasibility of really getting into more cattle feeding occurring in Missouri and maybe processing as well.
And that's what
Go ahead.
I was going to say. That's what we've talked about too. And of course, Nevada and Missouri are very different geographically. Precipitation, and which brings me to you meant in that paper, there was a short discussion about the need for water as an input to feedlots and processing, and that in Missouri there was a concern that the Ogallala Aquifer was drying down. Of course, we would love to have an aquifer like Ogallala here in Nevada. We're pretty darn dry. So can you just talk briefly about the importance of water as an input, or how that might have influenced Missouri's analysis of the feasibility?
So there's a combination of things that have to go on when you talk about water. So number one, you'd sure like to have a local supply of crops. So we grow a lot of corn in Missouri, especially along the Missouri River. You want to make sure you have enough moisture for adequate crop growth, so you don't have to transport that feed all that far if at all possible. That's probably our leg up relative to a Western Kansas, especially if you talk about that aquifer continuing to drain down. They've certainly used a lot of irrigation to grow corn in places like Western Kansas. If they don't have that opportunity, I think it makes us more cost competitive being closer to the feed side. But even running those plants takes a lot of water. So you have to look at how far you're going to have to pull on that water to get it accessible for some of the processing that goes on. We certainly have places in Missouri that are very well suited in terms of water availability. Other places where you're going to have to go pretty deep to find reasonable supplies of water for what both processing as well as feed yards need. And again, we're sometimes blessed with too much water, which feeding cattle when they're standing knee deep in mud is not very efficient. And so the runoff associated creates some environmental issues we also have to deal with. So and then I always say, if Missouri was destined to be a processor, there would be a lot of large current processors interested in building a plant in Missouri. So I think, we've seen this industry evolve in a way where different areas of the country have specialized in different parts of it for a reason. I always go as an economist, it's always about how cheap and what does it cost in different parts of the country to do different parts of that beef production system.
Scott, I agree. I got my master's at Texas Tech back when.
I'm sorry.
What? Well, way back when I had Sam Houston and Santa Ana were in my class. When that whole thing exploded at feedlots in the Amarillo, the Ogallala Aquifers there. It was a good place to grow grain sorghum and all that. And that kind of course, we don't have aquifers like here in the desert. And that's why you've seen all that massive growth from, I want to say, from the Texas Panhandle all up western Kansas and Missouri, and that's because of that. And they've been, like I said, when I did my thesis, I was looking at the economic impacts of declining water in the Ogallala Aquifer, and after it gets drained, they'll spend another 50 years figuring out how they could really done it right. So, but they've still been coming, but technology has helped them a lot with that. And Amarillo is still a big area for feedlots, very big.
And I think we're a long ways away from those feed yards going away in those places. And you're right, Tom, technologies come on, whether it's the amount of water we need to make that corn grow or grain sorghum grow, some phenomenal technology related to drought resistance and so forth that I think has changed the pull on that aquifer as well.
Malieka said, that's one of the things. You have to look at your natural resources. What's the difference between Nevada and the high plains is that water and that, and also with the expanding, with the COVID kind of opening up. I'm going to refer to something Mike, you told me in a conversation. If the casinos open up, will there be demands for different cuts of meat? You remember you were saying when it was in the regular, when you have the casinos, you have the very expensive cuts of meat that people were looking at. That, I think that's going to reappear. I don't know how the buffet is going to do, but as the more June, what we see right now, what I've seen in the newspaper is not only advertising opening the casinos, but also the name brand restaurants, which means high quality meat. It's going to be.
Yeah, you're right, and Scott, you know more about this than I do, but as you look at the cutout values recently, it used to be that those high-end cuts kind of dominated that, drove that, and now in COVID, it's switched over to a little more of the stuff that you might buy in a grocery store, and it's reduced it. So,
yeah, that's absolutely right. So I go, generally, that's right. I go things like bacon, certainly was driven by food service, steaks, high-end restaurants. So I go, when you look at food away from home consumption or expenditures,
right,
outpacing food at home expenditures, then all of a sudden that decision is made by the restaurant I choose, not standing in front of the meat case at the grocery store. And I think a really good example of this, I tell the pork industry all the time. 9 months ago, I would said, if you can figure out a way to get wholesale loin prices on the pork side to get above $1, you're going to help yourself a lot. And now I've told them, well, little did I know that COVID-19 was what we needed to do that. I wish I would have never said that out loud. But pork loin prices seem to have been more responsive as we've made that switch to grocery store of late. And I agree with you, as we open food service and we go back to consuming more things away from home, ground beef, I think, will go up. Steaks will go up. Bacon will go back up. And we'll see things like pork loins that we might more traditionally think of as grocery store use will head back down. Chicken wings will go up. You can kind of look at the different restaurants, and to me, this has a lot to do with the degree of substitutability among meats. I've been arguing it's gone down over time as the restaurant choice makes the decision, not sitting directly and looking at beef versus pork versus chicken.
Great discussion. Thank you all. Any final thoughts before we say goodbye for the day?
Thank you very much, Scott. That's very.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
That was great for having me on. I appreciate it. Everybody stay safe.
Be well. Thanks, everybody. You take care.
Keep on betting on the Missouri Tigers.
There we go. I'll keep doing it. All right.